Street Fighter II is a violent game of conflict between two opposing forces. Here's another violent conflict between two opposing forces, the Sega Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. Which version of Street Fighter II is better? For starters, both of these games are from Capcom, and they're excellent versions of Street Fighter II, the arcade classic. They're both named different things. The Sega Genesis version here is Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition and cost $2.50 used. Both of my copies of Street Fighter II were purchased used and banged up with stickers everywhere. This one even had somebody's name on it, so I wrote the name of the proper owner in. And this is Street Fighter II for the Super Nintendo called Street Fighter II Turbo. And this game also cost $2.50 and has a completely different graphic on the front, still featuring Street Fighter II characters. The good news is for $5 you can pick up both of them, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition and Street Fighter II Turbo. On Classic Game Room, we're here to find out what the difference is between these two game cartridges. The Super Nintendo game cartridge is enormous compared to the Sega Genesis. Let's plug these into their respective game systems and put them head to head in a challenge to the death.
Can't we all just get along? Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition on the left on the Sega Genesis, Street Fighter II Turbo on the Super Nintendo on the right, side by side, head-to-head comparison.
Round one, fight! Go that fire!
Which version is better? Well, at the end of this two-part review, it's likely that we'll come to no conclusion whatsoever, but we'll have a good time getting there. I think both games are very similar on the Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis. I captured the footage for this review on the same Super VHS player through S-Video. And I find the differences in the backgrounds between the two games and the music to be the most fascinating part of this comparison.
You win! You win!
Graphically, they're nearly identical.
Round one, fight!
I think, as some other people have pointed out in the previous reviews of these games that I've done, that the Sega looks and sounds more chunky. That's not a bad word to use. I think that graphically they're both very sharp, rich, and colorful, but the Genesis has higher contrast. The Super Nintendo graphics seem smoother, slightly desaturated in comparison.
You win! Round one, fight!
Here's a pretty striking difference in backgrounds, Chun-Li versus Ryu. And in the background of the Sega Genesis version, you see we have a moon and some birds or bats or something flying around in the background, whereas the Super Nintendo version does not have that. Also, this is a nice example of the added saturation that the Genesis version gives you in some of the scenes. The gameplay between the two is very similar. I think that there's more lag or slowdown in the Super Nintendo version when you're shooting things across the screen. The Sega Genesis version has the Hyper mode, which can make the game way faster than Street Fighter II Turbo on the Super Nintendo. I'm playing them at about the same speed. Here on Chun-Li vs. E Honda, there's slight differences in the backgrounds, but not much.
Round one.
Notice when you win that the "you win" is different, and the audio is obviously extremely different between the two. Chun-Li vs. Ryu on the Sega Genesis had the animation with the birds in the background, but here on Chun-Li vs. Blanka, we see the clouds moving in the back of the Super Nintendo version, but not the Sega Genesis version.
Fight. You win.
There's a huge difference in the ending screens after you beat him. Here's the Super Nintendo version, and then in the Sega Genesis version, you can see he's been really pounded, and his eyeballs hanging out, and his hair's all messed up.
USA.
That's the kind of stuff that we waste our time doing here on Classic Game Room, finding out which characters look bloodier and more beaten up in Street Fighter 2.
Sonic boom. Sonic boom.
Let's take a look at some full-screen gameplay here. This is the Super Nintendo version, Chun-Li vs. Guile. This is a good scene to show the difference in graphics. In the background on the F-16 and in the sky, you can note the Super Nintendo has a smoother gradation of color. On the Sega Genesis version, it's much higher contrast. The pixels are much bigger and blockier. And when you look at the two of them side by side, they look almost identical on the small screens, but note that the Super Nintendo version has clouds going further down into the sky. The Sega Genesis version has the girl and the guy on the left, right in front of the intake, in front of the F-16, whereas the Super Nintendo version does not have them. We can only speculate as to what happened to that couple. Were they in a relationship? Did they break up? Did they get sucked into the jet intake? We don't know for sure, and we probably never will. Chun-Li vs. Ken, my biggest adversary. I find him to be the most challenging guy to defeat. Difference in background colors. Also, you can make out the name of the boat more on the Sega Genesis version than you can on the Super Nintendo version.
Round one. Fight.
You can really hear the difference in the way these two game systems output the music tracks here. The Genesis is much harsher, has higher frequencies on the treble, and the bass is much deeper, whereas the Super Nintendo seems to have the treble rolled off and a bit more complexity in the music itself, but it's all been softened out. One thing we can all agree upon is that if Chun-Li were to fight Chun-Li, that Chun-Li would win and Chun-Li would lose. Which means that we're all winners. Raise your hand if you're a winner. You can also raise your hand if you're sure. Sure about being a winner. See you back here in part 2 when we look at the different colors of pimps and bikinis.